All right. Hey guys, how's it going? So, I've just been in the process of creating a reference pack full of skulls and bones. And alongside that, I've been doing my own studies, as you can see here on my screen. And, I just thought I would record my process for these little studies. Let me just show you a little bit what I've done. I'm trying to keep these pretty small, pretty loose, and painterly. I'm using my brushes from my Photoshop Master Pack. I'll talk about some of my choices as I do the study, but let me just zoom in on a few of these so you can see. A very brushy, expressive look is what I'm after here. I don't want to spend too much time. I'm not trying to copy all the details that I see in my references here. And part of the reason I enjoy putting a bunch of studies up on one page like this is that it sort of makes each one less intimidating and feel, less serious. Like, I don't feel like I have to get super tight with any of them because they're all just, cobbled together here on the page. Um, to me, it's just more fun this way. So I thought I would show off, my techniques here, talk a little bit about the brushes, talk a little bit about the reference pack. And so let me just jump in here with this next reference that I have set up. So I kind of begin all these a little differently, but in general, my strategy is very, very simple. I want to start with the big shapes and work towards the small shapes. So what I often like to kind of start with too is just, can I make a general observation? Like, what's the most dominant sort of color and value that I see? In this case, this skull is kind of planted in the sand here, kind of a beige, warm coloration, a little bit of variety as well. So I'm just going to get something that's kind of in that ballpark. And I'm also going to go ahead and lay in this sort of big gradation I see from the dark background to the light foreground. So I had a lot of fun with this reference pack. I have a bunch of skulls, all sorts of skulls. In this case, I'm just showcasing a replica human skull that I have in the pack, but I also have a bunch of animal skulls of all sorts, all ethically sourced. But yeah, I've had a lot of fun sort of posing them, arranging them, and fun compositions. Lots of still life compositions with other sort of, interesting objects. But also, I've been, really playing with the lighting as well. As you can see in all of these, I've been going for a lot of variety of light direction and using both natural lights, sunlight coming through my window, and also artificial lights. This one here is underneath an artificial light. But, of course, even when I'm using artificial lighting, I try to make it feel quite natural as well. That's always been one of my big goals with these reference packs. I want to have really attractive lighting that just looks fun to draw or paint from. And so, yeah, I'm kind of working in my go-to sort of painterly style for these studies, but you could definitely do whatever sort of style you like as well. You could do line drawing, you could do really sharp and shapely digital painting if you want. But I am, just kind of going for more of a traditional look here with these. Again, using my Photoshop Master Pack brushes. I like to have a lot of fun, organic looking texture and whatnot. So I'm just laying this in now. And, what I really want to encourage myself to do is ignore the little details, like completely see past the smaller shapes of this form and really, kind of see the skull initially as like a big sphere. Completely ignore the eye sockets and all the other intricate bumps and crevices and all the fun stuff that's happening, I want to try and ignore that initially, because I'm more interested in just capturing a sense of light on three-dimensional form, and I want to do it fairly quickly and efficiently, get that effect to read as well and as quickly as I can before I decide to move on. And I'm not going to stress like super accuracy with this. I'm not trying to be super detailed or photographic in my rendering. I really just want a fun painting. So I'm looking at the shapes that I see, and I want to be in the ballpark in terms of accuracy, but there's definitely going to be a little bit off, both in terms of placement and value. But I actually kind of want some of that. I don't want my end result to just be a replica of the reference. I think it's far more interesting when the study is unique and it has made deliberate departures from the reference. So once I begin to sense like a feeling of form, like almost like I could reach in and grab it, then I will begin to add a bit more nuance to it. But, one of the things I have to constantly tell myself is to have a bit of patience, have a bit of restraint, even though it's so tempting to really jump into those fun details that I see. It's far more important that I spend a little bit of time sort of refining the simple statements that I already have. But before I add more complexity, try to instead refine what I already have placed down. And this is something I want to constantly do throughout the process. Like every stage of detail, I want to do this. I want to pause and force myself to refine what I already have. It's good at this stage to also kind of go ahead and make mental notes of like, where are the areas of highest contrast, where are the areas of lowest contrast in the subject. So highest contrast is definitely feeling, kind of, towards the facial area. This beautiful cast shadow is really nice and strong, deep dark there. So we have a lot of contrast happening pretty much right around the nose here, and around the eyes. Whereas the opposite side, where the bone meets the sand, that's pretty low contrast. Even though we can see an edge there, the value difference between the bone and the sand is actually not that great. So that might be an area where I kind of, in the painting, I just let that edge be very soft or even disappear entirely. So anywhere else where there's low contrast, I just want to make note of it. You can also make note of the lightest lights, the darkest darks, the areas with the most vivid color, and sometimes I'll go ahead and kind of place it in. As you can see, I put a bit of a highlight on the skull here just to kind of mark sort of like the lightest value that I'm seeing. And I also kind of want to go ahead and place in the darker values as well, just so I have a full value range, and therefore I can place everything else within correct relation to that. Alright, so now I'm going to start adding some smaller shapes to begin to carve out the smaller, more intricate forms that I see. And I really do like to think of it as sculpting. I put down my big lump of raw material, and now I'm able to carve into it. The lighting is nice and high contrast, so we have these really clear shadow shapes. And that's one thing I was very conscious of while creating this reference pack, is to have very clear lighting that casts really clear and easy to see shapes of shadow and shapes of light on the subject. To me, this just makes it so much more fun to draw and paint from than something that might be more obscure. I'm forcing myself also to stay fairly zoomed out, as you can see. Now, I know, unfortunately, it makes it a little bit hard for the viewer of the recording to see everything that I'm doing, but I do just want to stress the importance of staying zoomed out. It's always tempting to keep zooming up closer and closer to the subject, but I don't want to do that, because if I do, I'm going to just naturally begin to start focusing more on smaller details that really are not at all useful at this stage. Small details will only distract me and, make it harder for me to focus on these big, important statements that I really need to focus on. So I had this fun idea with this set to utilize sand, which gets quite messy, but it's a really fun way to kind of to be able to place the skulls in the sand so that they're partially submerged in areas. I have a lot that are kind of just sitting on a flat surface as well, but the sand is so fun because you can, kind of embed the bones and the skulls within the sand and create all these interesting shapes that you couldn't otherwise achieve. I think it also just kind of goes pretty well with the subject matter too. It's almost like it's being excavated here in this photo. But yeah, I started taking reference images of my own as I began teaching digital painting and drawing, because I wanted to provide my students with really quality reference. I think one of the most common pitfalls, the most common issues that I see with student work is often that they just find really poor reference, typically in regards to lighting. I think it's super important, especially when you're learning, to have reference of very clear lighting such as this, and try to avoid subjects that are lit from multiple different directions. You'll often see, unfortunately, even in museums, they'll often have ceiling lights that are, spotlights that are coming down from various directions onto a sculpture. And even though the sculpture itself might be very beautiful, unfortunately, that kind of lighting is really pretty terrible to work from, to study from, because the more light sources you have, the more it really multiplies the intricacy of the shadow pattern. You'll have lots of overlapping cast shadows, sometimes to the point where it's almost hard to make sense of what's happening. So I much prefer my reference to be under very simple lighting. One dominant light source, maybe some natural reflected light coming into the scene, but I don't want to have a bunch of different lights coming from all different directions. So that was a key consideration for this reference pack. So as you can see, I haven't put much detail down really yet, but just by getting those shadow shapes, the subject's already reading pretty clearly, right? And I really want to embrace that. I don't want to add much more detail, actually. Not for these little studies. Maybe if I want to do a longer, more intricate study, I would, really pack a lot more into it. But I'm really wanting to pretend that this is like a really tiny, like 5 by 5 inch canvas, and I'm like using traditional paint with a big brush. If you're using a big brush on a small canvas, there's sort of a natural limit to how much detail you can get into it. And that's the vibe I'm aiming for here. So I'm just, again, reminding myself to zoom out, trying to place these shapes down with broad strokes. Like I said, I want some edges to blend in wherever I see areas of low contrast. Might just let those edges disappear. We often think that we need to clarify and make every edge really obvious for the viewer, but I think that can really stiffen up and deaden a painting. And really, as much as possible, just try to imply edges so that the viewer can then connect the dots, and they'll actually have more fun doing that. If you allow them to participate, to use their brains, they will find much more enjoyment in looking at the image than if you try to spell everything out very clearly. I really like to have a chiseled look, so there's a lot of areas, especially on the upper cranium here, where it would be tempting to just very smoothly blend these brush strokes together. And, in some areas I might want to do that, but I also want to have areas where the strokes have this chunky, sort of blocky feel to them, and they're not just blending seamlessly into the strokes next to them. So right now I'm using a brush called the Supple Stroke. Again, one of the brushes in my pack, the Photoshop Master Pack. I also have this brush here called NYX. Let me play around with it a little. So this is a very versatile brush because, you know, if you're just tapping, you can get some fun organic texture. You can get some really soft, smooth, graceful transitions. If you press down firmly, you can also get some really sharp, crisp edges. So I really like it when a brush can achieve a full range of effects simply by how you wield it in your hand. And so you don't have to constantly jump to a new brush. And so for most of these studies on this page, I've used maybe 2, 3, maybe a fourth brush here and there. But yeah, it doesn't take many. I've really tried to imbue these brushes with a lot of natural texture, very much inspired by my experience with traditional tools. I think with digital painting, we have to be a bit more conscious to try to create an illusion of a surface. Traditional painting, it comes naturally, innately. The surface you're painting on will provide some texture for the painting, and that will come through. But with digital painting, we don't have that, and so if you're not very conscious of adding texture, you'll tend to have more of just a soft, often kind of mushy looking quality to your painting. The more you tend to overlap digital pixels, the softer they tend to sort of interact with each other. So yeah, a key goal with my brush set is to imbue some really natural texture into them. I'm also, one of the key features of my brush set too is that I take advantage of pin tilt sensitivity to control the rotation of the brush. So if I take a thin brush such as this, for example, if I hold my pin one way, it comes out horizontally. If I simply rotate my hand, I can make a vertical mark, and I can do anything in between as well, simply by rotating my hand. And it's just a fabulous feature that's really often underutilized. It's kind of surprising to me. Most sets really don't use it, but it's a key feature that I applied to most, not all, but most of the brushes in my set. So this is actually not far from finished. And even though it would be very tempting to keep rendering lots of little details, like I said, that's not really the goal here. I'm really wanting to get that big impression of a loose painting. One way I can kind of begin to refine this, though, is to switch over to some mixer brushes. Now, if you're not familiar, mixer brushes in Photoshop are pretty unique. They allow you to take anywhere on your canvas. Let me just grab from the reference to make it clear. You can grab anywhere on the canvas, and you can pick up the colors of the point you just grabbed from. So the shape of my brush becomes the area that is selected, that is sampled whenever I press the sample button. And then it's picked up. And this is just a fabulous way to get some really natural, sort of oily looking strokes. And it's at this stage of the painting where I already have a lot already on my canvas that I can sample from, that I like to begin using it. And so I'll just kind of, here and there, I'll begin to introduce some of these fun, textured, oily looking strokes. It's often something I like to use in the background as well. With these studies, I'm going for sort of a, an unfinished sort of vignette sort of look to all the edges. So you can see, I'm kind of letting the edges taper out in fun ways. Just like letting the brushes be expressive towards the edges. So same idea here. I'm just trying to add a few finishing touches now. It's a good idea at this stage to flip the canvas to get a fresh perspective. Without a doubt, after I spend a few minutes looking at something, I will tend to become a bit blind to issues. Things just don't really jump out after a while. And so, just like a traditional painter might look at their work in a mirror, you can flip your canvas to get a fresh perspective of your painting. Now, if I add too much detail, I will actually begin to kind of stiffen the rendering up. It'll become kind of a little too tight. That often happens with me, so I have to just be very careful. It's always tempting just to keep adding more and more. But like I said, the focus really needs to be on refining what you already have in place. Because if you can refine what you've already got, you'll often find that it doesn't need any more. It already expresses a lot of information. All right, so yeah, I think as a quick study, I'm pretty happy with this. I might come back later, an hour or two when I have fresh eyes and refine it a bit more. I often like to do that. But as a good start, I think I'm quite satisfied with this. So I want to, just encourage you to do some studies like this if you're on. Definitely pick up my reference pack, my brushes if you're interested. And have fun. All right, I'll leave it there. See ya.